Rebecca here, and today I'm going to do an overview of one of my favorite authors, and one who I feel like a lot of people are intimidated by, and maybe you shouldn't be. That is the Great Boz, also known as Charles Dickens. I'm going to talk to you about the books of his that I have read. I'm not going to talk to you about the books that I have not read yet, because that would just be silly, but know that there are many more books that I have not read. I have read 7 of his works, and they're his most prolific works, more or less. Really briefly, I'm not going to get into too much background, but Charles Dickens was born in 1812. He died of a stroke in 1870. He is, of course, an English author who is very famous for his serialized novels. And I'm going to talk to you about the books of his that I've read in publication order. First, I have Oliver Twist. This was serialized in a publication called Bentley's Miscellany, and it ran from February 1836 to November 1837. This is not his earliest work, but is the earliest of his that I have read. Oliver Twist is a pretty classic tale that most of you are probably familiar with. It tells the story of Oliver, an orphan, who moves to London and gets involved in a thieving gang. It is most definitely a coming-of-age tale in a way, but it also houses some of the greatest villains of literature. I'm talking about Bill Sikes, I'm talking about Fagin, I'm talking about Nancy the prostitute, and what's amazing about Dickens' villains is that they oftentimes, towards the end of his stories, start to demonstrate a little bit of humanity that you didn't think was possible. That's definitely the case for characters like Nancy in this book. I read this book when I was about 22 for pleasure. I was not assigned it for class, and it is often I feel like this novel is overlooked because so many people are already familiar with the story through stage and film adaptations, but I highly recommend that you read the book because there's so much more depth to the characters that you can't really get out of a movie or a play. So please check this out. The next work of Dickens I'm going to talk about is A Christmas Carol. And I'm not going to talk about all of the stories in this collection. There's more than just A Christmas Carol. But I'm going to talk about A Christmas Carol, which was published in 1843. This is another story that many people are familiar with because it has been adapted so many times. My personal favorites is The Muppets, I gotta say. So you know the story of Scrooge, who is a miserly old man who hates Christmas, and how the ghosts of Christmas, past, present, and future, come to visit him. And he reforms and brings Christmas cheer to all. Everyone, of course, is familiar with Tiny Tim. But I do recommend reading it because I feel like especially the ghosts, the spirits in the book are so well laid out that you don't often get their characteristics in the movies. In the movies, they're kind of side characters that don't have their own unique personalities, but in the book, they are really, really interesting. I think that if you are intimidated by Dickens, that starting by reading A Christmas Carol, preferably at Christmas time, but it doesn't have to be, is a really great place to start with him, especially because it's a story that people are familiar with already, so it doesn't take quite as much to wrap your brain around his, classic 1800s writing style, because you already have an idea of what's going on. Next, I have perhaps my favorite Dickens novel, and this is David Copperfield. This was serialized from May of 1849 to November of 1850, and this is the story of David Copperfield, who is growing up in a bit of a tumultuous family situation, and it's basically a coming-of-age tale about him coming to realize what he wants out of life and out of love. This is said to be the most biographical of Dickens' novels, and you can definitely see that if you look more into his history. There's a character in this book called Micawber, who is always having many trouble, always, and he kind of provides some comic relief to the tale, but he eventually ends up in debtor's prison, and if you're familiar with Charles Dickens' history at all, his father, when Dickens was 12, was taken away to debtor's prison, and Dickens was then forced to drop out of school and work in a shoeblacking factory. So this definitely brings to light a lot of Dickens history. I don't recommend starting with this. It is big. It kind of drags on at points. But I think that you can definitely tell that Dickens put his heart into this novel, and I absolutely love it. This novel contains one of the creepiest characters I've ever read, and that is Uriah Heep, who is portrayed as this, like, pale, quivering guy who gets up to all sorts of trickery, and he's just, ugh, gives me the creeps. So, that is David Copperfield. Next, I have another book that I would only recommend to people who are already familiar with some of Dickens' work, and that is Bleak House. This was serialized from March 1852 to September 1853. Bleak House is a book that a lot of fans of Dickens that I found really, really love. I find it to be the most gothic of his novels. It's a little bit dark. There's a bit of a mystery story to it. It's a story of Richard and Ava Clare, whose story kind of represents the decay that is happening in society as all of their inheritance money is caught up in courts, and it's slowly dwindling away, and they'll probably never see it. It's also simultaneously the story of an orphan named Esther Summons, who is a ward of the court, and it's the story of her parentage and where she came from. Again, there are great villains in this. I think if there's anything that Dickens does really superbly that is worth studying, it's his villains. And this is, like I said, it's a little dark. It's a little dark, but it's also a bit of a page turner. The only reason that I don't recommend it if you're not familiar with Dickens is because I don't think it's the best example of his typical story. And it's also huge. So it can be a little bit intimidating. But if you've read a couple of Dickens' more famous works, perhaps like Great Expectations and A Christmas Carol, I definitely think that you should turn here soon. Next, I have the Dickens novel that I've most recently read, and that is Hard Times. I read this back at the end of November, beginning of December of 2014. This is a tiny novel by Dickens standards, for sure. And this was a weekly serial published in a publication called Household Words from April 1854 to August 1854. So as you can tell, it is definitely shorter. It didn't have as long of a run in its serial form. And this is a story about machinery versus humanity, really at its heart. It has characters such as Tom Gradgrind, who raise his children to be like the machinery he has developed in factories. And he raises them to be very prim and proper and concise. He says, "What is a horse?" And they say, "A horse is a quadruped, blah, 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 blah." And he doesn't believe in fancy or imagination. And his children ultimately rebel against this. And it's about the characters that they come across when they're allowed to really interact with the real world and get out from under their father's thumb. I do think that this could be a good place to start with Dickens. I think that it definitely houses some of the themes that are universal to his work, such as the poor treatment of factory workers in the industrial times and the poverty that people experience. So, and it's shorter. Like I said, it was a pretty quick read. It was a bit of a page turner, actually. So you could start here with him, though I think that there are more prolific works of his that would be a better place to go to first, honestly. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Everyone is familiar with the famous opening lines of Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. This is a historical fiction novel that is set during the French Revolution. And this was serialized in a publication called All Year Round from April to November of 1859. I think that this is Dickens' most beloved work by people who have read it. I think that it's his most romantic piece of fiction that I've read of his yet. It focuses on two main male characters, Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton, who in themselves, because one is a French aristocrat and one is an English lawyer, are kind of a play on the two cities, which of course are London and Paris. And the story is about the love that each of these men develop for a character called Lucy Monet and what they are ultimately willing to sacrifice for her. This, again, is one of the creepiest characters, Madame Defarge. I don't know if I'm saying that right at all. Who is a French character who is always knitting. She's just knitting. Oh, God, she creeps me out. I think this is a beautiful novel. I think that's really heartbreaking. I do think that it's one of Dickens' best, though it's not typical of him. It is historical fiction rather than being a novel set in Dickens' contemporary London, in the streets and the factories and things of that nature, which he's most well known for. But this could be a really great place to start to fall in love with Dickens, I think, if you haven't already. And lastly, I have Great Expectations. This is a book that I really need to revisit because I was assigned this when I was 14 years old, in 9th grade, my first year of high school. And we had to read the unabridged version. I had never read any Dickens before, and it was tough going. Everyone hated it. And for that reason, I have a bit of lingering resentment for this book. I have revisited it a little bit since then, but I have not read it in its entirety since then. And this, again, was serialized in the publication All Year Round from December of 1860 to August of 1861. It is another story of an orphan called Pip who comes across a mysterious anonymous benefactor who provides him with the finances to live in London. It is, of course, also the story of Miss Havisham, the creepy old woman who's stuck in her past. And ultimately, it is a love story between Pip and Estella. I think this is a great place to start with Dickens. I feel like it's very accessible, and because it is one of his latest works, his writing style has really been refined. So I do recommend starting here if you're interested. And again, this is a great story. They're all great. I love them all so much. So that is my author overview of Charles Dickens with all of his major works that I have read. Again, I just want to reinforce that I feel like a lot of people are intimidated by Dickens, of course, because, first of all, he was writing in the mid-19th century, and the language is a bit antiquated, and secondly, because his books are generally quite long. But I encourage you to dip into them, especially if you like coming-of-age tales, especially if you enjoy reading sociocultural critique about that time period. I think that Dickens really nails those two elements on the heads in a lot of his major works. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. If you have any suggestions of the next Dickens novel I should pick up, please let me know. I don't really know what I'm going to read next by him, but I'm definitely going to continue on in the hopes of someday completing all of his major works. And thank you so much for watching, and have a good one. Bye.